History as it happens, April 11th, 2024. Who is ISIS-K?
Reports from Moscow suggesting a number of people have been killed and wounded during a shooting at a concert hall.
A number of armed men burst into a concert hall, Crocus City Hall, just before a pop concert.
Intelligence sources indicate the attack was carried out by a branch of the so-called Islamic State group in Afghanistan.
The terror group is named after an old term for a region that spreads over parts of Iran, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan.
And the risk of an attack emanating from Afghanistan is increasing. ISS Khorasan retains the capability and will to attack U.S. and Western interests abroad in as little as 6 months and with little to no warning.
This was a mass shooting on civilians, not usually the work of a nation state.
Rather than seeding democracy so it might blossom across the Middle East, the U.S. war on terrorism led to endless instability and violence, birthing new, ever more radical groups dedicated to jihad. Al-Qaeda in Iraq morphed into ISIS, and now one of its offshoots is committing mass murder thousands of miles from its base in Afghanistan. Who is ISIS-K? That's next with Peter Bergen as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. And no one will keep that light from shining.
To those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this: we will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay.
Where was ISIS born? It was born in Syria. Really, I mean, the prehistory of all this is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, obviously born in Iraq, went through multiple changes of names, was basically defeated by the US military in 2010, let's say. It migrated into Syria. After Al-Qaeda in Iraq was more or less defeated by the US military, it migrated into Syria and got involved in the Syrian civil war starting in 2011. That's where ISIS was birthed, and then they crossed back the border into Iraq in 2014.
The first time I remember hearing the name ISIS-K, K for Khorasan, was August 2021.
The airport assault was one of 2 suicide attacks that killed scores of Afghans, wounding more than 140 others.
These American service members who gave their lives, it's an overused word, but it's totally appropriate here, were heroes. Heroes who have been engaged in a dangerous, selfless mission to save the lives of others.
It's being described as a complex attack conducted by the terror group known as ISIS-K.
The attack at the airport in Kabul as the U.S. completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan. The following year, ISIS-K claimed responsibility for a deadly suicide attack at the Russian embassy in Kabul. And then this January, its jihadists struck the memorial service in Iran for General Qasem Soleimani. Remember, he was assassinated by the United States in 2020. And at the memorial service a few months ago, a pair of explosions near Soleimani's tomb killed dozens more. And then, last month, ISIS-K gunmen showed up in Moscow.
Dressed in combat fatigues, at least 4 gunmen burst into a concert hall in Moscow.
You look at that video if you have, and you got to recognize that there's some moms and dads and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters that haven't gotten the news yet. And this is going to be a tough day. So our thoughts are with them. You might have also seen, hopefully you saw the State Department, our embassy there, put out a notice to all Americans in Moscow to avoid any large gathering, concerts, obviously shopping malls, anything like that, just for their own safety. They should stay put where they are.
137 people killed in an apparent retaliation for Russian involvement in Syria's civil war. So who are these guys? Who is their leader? The journalists Mohammed Yunus Yawar, Mushtaq Ali, and Y.P. Rajesh, reporting for Reuters, spoke to more than a dozen sources, including serving and retired security and intelligence officials in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and the U.S., and they say members of the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban. The sources said ISIS-K exploited the Taliban's failure to eliminate its safe havens in northern and eastern Afghanistan to expand regionally. They report under its 29-year-old leader, ISIS-K has used high-profile attacks as a recruiting tool and targeted for recruiting ethnic Tajiks and Uzbeks across Central Asia, rather than Afghanistan's Pashtun majority, which forms the backbone of the Taliban. They go on to say ISIS-K takes its name from an old Persian term for the region, Khorasan, including parts of Iran, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan, as well as parts of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Again, this is all according to this report in Reuters. The difficulty in tracing origin stories is where to begin. Where did the modern wave of radical Islam, espousing violence and doctrinal purity, begin? 1979 is a good year to start, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which provoked jihadist resistance, and with the Islamic Revolution in Iran that year.
Ayatollah Khomeini returns to a country teetering on the brink of civil war.
Khomeini was being helped down the steps of his chartered Air France jet to set foot on Iranian ground for the first time in 15 years.
Some 60 Americans are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
Another year that may immediately come to mind is 2001, September 11th, 2001.
A plane has crashed into the World Trade Center in New York. That happened within
We don't know if it was a commercial aircraft. We don't know if it was a private aircraft. We have no idea how many were on board or what the extent.
Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger.
The day that forced Americans to begin paying attention to al-Qaeda, which had been around for some time, as we know. You'll recall the embassy bombings in Africa, the USS Cole attack in 2000. Our guest in this episode interviewed Osama bin Laden in 1997. That was when bin Laden declared war on the United States. It was the U.S. response to 9/11, which in the long run did severely damage al-Qaeda and killed bin Laden, that caused new problems, one after another. Al-Qaeda in Iraq only existed because the U.S. invaded Iraq and toppled Saddam Hussein. It morphed into ISIS. That Reuters report says when ISIS, or the Islamic State, collapsed during the war in Iraq in 2017, many of its fighters fled and reached Afghanistan and Pakistan to join ISIS-K, bringing their expertise in guerrilla warfare that developed the group's ability to launch attacks in other countries, like Iran and now Russia. So, do you notice a pattern here? Armed groups or militias or terrorist organizations are wreaking havoc across the greater Middle East. As we discussed in our most recent episode with Renaud Mansour, a problem U.S. airstrikes and sanctions cannot solve, a conflict without borders. So, in a way, talking about discrete wars in, say, Iraq and then another one in Syria, a different one in Afghanistan, obscures the transnational character of what we're dealing with. You know, after the Kabul airport attack in 2021, President Biden talked about adopting a new strategy or approach to the problem of jihadist terrorism, one that did not necessitate having ground troops in places like Afghanistan.
I firmly believe the best path to guard our safety and our security lies in a tough, unforgiving, targeted, precise strategy that goes after terror where it is today, not where it was 2 decades ago.
Well, as Renaud Mansour and I discussed last episode, airstrikes against hostile armed groups in Iraq haven't solved anything. Like kicking a beehive and hoping you'll kill the bees only to watch them scatter for a minute before stinging you again. In an explainer for the Wilson Center, Asfandyar Mir writes, from 2016 to 2020, ISIS-K's overall capacity for violence, political cohesion, and territorial influence was weakened by sustained targeting from 3 sides: the U.S. military, the former Afghan government, and their sworn enemy, the Afghan Taliban. Yet that pressure failed to moderate ISIS-K's political goals and civilian targeting. More now with Peter Bergen, CNN national security analyst and vice president at New America. He is the author of several must-read books on this topic, including The Longest War and The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. I talked to Peter about his bin Laden biography. That episode is titled, Who Was Osama bin Laden? I'll make sure to put a link to it in this week's newsletter just in case you missed it when I published it in 2021. Mr. Bergen also hosts an excellent podcast of his own, In the Room with Peter Bergen, produced by Audible and available on all major platforms. You should check out his recent episode with Christine Abizaid. They take on the subject we're going to discuss here, international terrorism and radicalization. And who is ISIS-K? Peter Bergen, welcome back.
Martin, thanks for having me on.
Your most recent episode of your podcast, In the Room with Peter Bergen, you interviewed Christine Abizaid about something related to what we're going to be discussing today. Really informative. I enjoyed that.
Well, thank you. And she's interesting because, she joined the intelligence community a year after 9/11 here when the National Counterterrorism Center didn't even exist with the center she now directs. She's the first woman to run it, first openly gay person to run it, and has spent, 20 years in the intelligence community. And she doesn't give a huge number of interviews. We actually talked about ISIS-K during the course of that conversation, which was recorded before the concert hall attack in Moscow, where at least 143 people were killed. And she mentioned she was quite concerned about ISIS-K. But frankly, I'm a little surprised that they were able to pull this off because, it's 2,000 miles from Afghanistan to Moscow. This is not like doing something in Tajikistan or something. Putin does run a police state, even though the police state is mostly directed at internal dissent. I see some discussion of, maybe this was a false flag operation by Putin, which he may well have done in the past, but that makes no sense in this case because it's so embarrassing. I mean, here's an attack in Moscow that kills 143 people, and he's running on a sort of strongman ticket in the election that just happened. And also Amaq, which is the ISIS mouthpiece, broadcast video of these guys in the attack. There's no false flag operation where ISIS has video of the attack that the attackers have sent to them. Well, I was surprised, Martin, that they could pull this off because I sort of tended to think of them as really focused on Afghanistan and not really having much capability beyond that, which turns out to be false.
Yeah, there is some debate as to whether they have global ambitions or just focused on their home country, if you will. I mean, the borders there don't matter, Pakistan, Afghanistan in some respects. But a couple of things. Yes, the fact that she gave you an interview, I was surprised by that. You don't hear officials like her giving too many interviews, so congrats there. Also, I live with the same problem you do as a podcast host and producer. You do an interview and then something happens before the interview can be published. But that's okay. People understand that.
We have no control over that.
Listeners understand that, and I often note that as well. People sometimes will listen to these conversations months later. Russia, the fact that this happened in Russia, apparently revenge for Russia's intervention in the Syrian civil war. I mean, is it even possible to know? Before we get to the history of ISIS-K here, the reason I had you come on, we can talk about what just happened in Russia.
We don't know exactly the motivation, but I mean, where was ISIS born? It was born in Syria. Really, I mean, the prehistory of all this is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, obviously born in Iraq, went through multiple changes of names, was basically defeated by the U.S. military in 2010, let's say. It migrated into Syria, which it had long had a sort of relationship with because Al-Qaeda in Iraq foreign fighters came through Syria with the connivance or amber light from the Syrian government because the Syrian government isn't a fan of the U.S. presence in Iraq. What happened was after Al-Qaeda in Iraq was more or less defeated by the U.S. military, it migrated into Syria and got involved in the Syrian civil war starting in 2011. That's where ISIS was birthed, and then they crossed back the border into Iraq in 2014 and took Mosul and everything that is pretty well known about ISIS. But yeah, why would ISIS continue to harbor hatred for the Syrian regime? Because in 2015, the Russians intervened in the Syrian civil war, and they basically rescued Assad, who was losing the war. Even more than I think the Iranians. The Iranians also were helping Assad, but the Russians provided a ton of air cover, bombing, and they basically helped Assad effectively win the civil war. So ISIS-K clearly has a long memory. And, that seems to be the principal motivation here.
I just discussed this with Renaud Mansour in my most recent episode about these groups. There are a lot of them. They're not all the same. Some of them are armed groups, as in Iraq, where they fought ISIS, and now some of them are interconnected with the Iraqi regime, the current Iraqi regime. But in other cases, like an all-out terrorist group like ISIS-K, a jihadist group, they're not really working with a government per se. They are living or they're operating out of an ungovernable area. What explains the timing of ISIS-K, which stands for Khorasan, the timing of their formation, if you will, in 2014, 2015 in Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan?
Well, they're opposed to the Taliban, who they don't think are sufficiently ideologically pure. Martin, I think that's a good question I can't completely answer. I mean, obviously, central ISIS in Iraq and Syria was beginning to feel a lot of pressure starting, in 2015, maybe from the U.S. military, the Iraqi military. By 2016, 2017, by 2017, ISIS had been largely completely defeated in Iraq. It did have a policy of setting up these regional affiliates. ISIS Khorasan. Khorasan is an old Persian word for the area that includes Afghanistan, parts of Iran, maybe parts of Pakistan. They seem to be mostly disaffected members of the Taliban who, don't forget, at this moment in time, the Taliban is beginning to do discussions, with the Afghan government, which are not secret, about maybe some kind of power sharing agreement. By the time the Trump administration comes in, there's negotiations with the Taliban with the United States. So ISIS-K is partly just a reaction against the Taliban maybe becoming more politically normal. Because if you look at what the ideology of ISIS-K is, and I just was reviewing it before our discussion because I was curious about what do they really want or believe in, it's mostly a very negative set of ideas. They're against the government of Pakistan. They're against the government of Iran. They're clearly against the government of Russia. And they're against the Taliban. Obviously, I think if they could attack the United States, they could, but I think that's highly unlikely. They can maybe carry out an attack in Europe. We've seen a number of ISIS-K operatives being arrested in Europe of late, but they don't really seem to have any positive vision. I'm not saying the Taliban has a very positive vision, but the Taliban does want to install a government in Afghanistan that controls Afghan territory and impose its quasi-medieval theocracy. ISIS-K doesn't seem to have that kind of plan in mind.
They are Sunni, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, then this is a very important point, I think. One of the biggest shifts since 9/11, Bin Laden's mother was an Alawite from Syria. Alawites are a kind of heretical form of Shiism, according to most Shia. And if you're a kind of conservative Sunni, are heretics. But, Al-Qaeda was never in the business of killing Shia. And in fact, they pushed back against it very heavily. When that was happening in Iraq, when Al-Qaeda in Iraq was killing a lot of Shia and blowing up Shia mosques, there was Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri. They were really sending messages, don't do that. So the big shift, it has been this anti-Shia shift, which wasn't part of Al-Qaeda's modus operandi. And that was really the defining thing for ISIS Central. And I think for ISIS-K, it's very important. I mean, we haven't discussed yet the attack that actually people should have paid more attention to perhaps at the time, which was that when the ISIS-K bombed a memorial service for Qasem Soleimani in Iran earlier this year. That showed that they had the ability to kill a lot of people, at least 84 people, and also do a big operation outside their borders. And presumably, Iran is a dictatorship of a certain kind. And this was very embarrassing for the Iranian regime that their hero, the memorial for their hero was, so many people were killed at it.
Yeah, and ISIS-K was behind the bombing at Kabul airport in 2021 during the final hours of the U.S. withdrawal.
Well, of course, and that killed 13 American service members and 170 Afghans.
Yeah, so they seem interested in spectacular terrorist attacks that make headlines all over the world.
Terrorism is usually married to a political objective, which makes sense. Even Al-Qaeda had a political objective. It didn't make a great deal of sense, but they wanted the U.S. to pull out of the Middle East, which attacking New York and Washington produced exactly the opposite result. But in ISIS-K, these are, as you say, spectacular acts of terrorism. What are they trying to achieve? It's not completely clear. They don't seem to have any desire to kind of control territory or to create a quasi-state in Afghanistan, at least as far as we can tell. They did have that ambition in Iraq and Syria when they controlled territory the size of the United Kingdom and population the size of Bulgaria, and they ran a state. It was the Islamic State. And it really was a state. They issued driving licenses and they taxed people and they behaved like a state. Obviously, they're very draconian and incompetent, but they had oil revenue. They were deriving money from selling antiquities. They were kidnapping people. They were taxing them. They were harassing people.
This is just within a few years of their creation, right? I mean, maybe this group of ISIS-K sticks around long enough, it'll have the same type of ambition. I mean, I have done a little reading about them here where they are interested in some kind of caliphate. They don't seem to have a lot of members. From what I gather, it's a few thousand people, fighters.
Yeah. If we go back to ISIS in Iraq, it was 30,000 people. You don't need a huge number of people, armed fighters. At one point, the Taliban, the typical estimates of the size of the Taliban were 30,000. So maybe that number went up by the time they seized Kabul. But if they do have a desire to kind of form a caliphate, obviously the Taliban would try and suppress it. And the Taliban is pretty well armed. After all, the United States left. When the United States left, there was $8.5 billion of material that was left behind, tanks, armored personnel carriers, etc. $8.5 billion, by the way, is the defense budget of a mid-sized European country. So, I mean, because there was, I think, this hope that the Taliban would suppress ISIS-K, and I think to some degree they did. But clearly, they did not enough to prevent like an attack in Moscow that we saw.
Yeah, I shouldn't laugh, but I mean, it is the folly of American foreign policy, all the weapons that we've have strewn all over the world. Maybe we'll get to that later. One explainer I found here at the wilsoncenter.org about ISIS-K, and this is something that we've discussed. Obviously, you've done work on this for decades. Your work on al-Qaeda has been fantastic, and we talked about your biography of Osama bin Laden that you wrote a year or so ago, to the point about the importance of understanding ideas, because it's easy to dismiss all these groups as fanatics, and of course many of them are, but they do have different ideas, and they take their own ideas seriously. But again, getting to this explainer here, it says, ISIS-K subscribes to the jihadi Salafism ideology and plays up the purity of its anti-idolatry credentials. The Taliban, on the other hand, subscribe to an alternative Sunni Islamic sectarian school, the Hanafi Madhab, my pronunciation's not perfect here, which ISIS-K regards as deficient. This author saying the enmity between the two groups, ISIS-K on one hand, the Taliban on the other, has been aggravated by sustained military hostilities, but the main cause remains their sectarian difference.
I mean, the thing that's so puzzling about all that, don't forget, it was the Taliban that blew up the Buddhas at Bamiyan, which had been there since like the 4th century. This was the main symbol of Afghanistan. They blew up the 2 giant Buddha statues. They also destroyed every Buddha statue in the Kabul Museum. So this anti-idolatry strain of the Taliban has always been there. In fact, when I was in Afghanistan, when the Taliban ruled there the last time, you couldn't watch TV, you couldn't listen to music. The Taliban have lightened up a bit on some of that. But, I'm not sure that the Taliban is any more pro-idols than any other Salafi. But I would say this sectarianism obviously is at the heart of ISIS. Now, before 9/11, when the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, they also indulged in a lot of attacks on the Shia Hazaras in Afghanistan. They have not done it this time around. ISIS-K clearly wants to continue that. Now, why has the Taliban not done it? I mean, they are the de facto government right now, or they did it last time they were in power. But I expected the Taliban to engage in more anti-Shia attacks, which they haven't done. Clearly, ISIS-K, if there is a raison d'etre, it's anti-Iran, anti-Shia.
And also, ethnically speaking, it seems that at the beginning, ISIS-K recruited from the Afghan Taliban, Pakistani Taliban, people who had been in the Iraq version of ISIS, went to Afghanistan to join ISIS-K. But from what I understand now, most of their members are Tajik and Uzbek, and not Pashtuns. The Taliban are mostly Pashtuns. I don't know if that's significant at all, but
when they say their recruits are Tajik and Uzbek, they're not necessarily from Tajikistan. They're not necessarily from Uzbekistan. Afghanistan has a very significant Tajik minority and a very significant Uzbek minority. So, it's not impossible that a group that positions itself against the Taliban would find recruits amongst Afghan Tajiks and Afghan Uzbeks who don't like the Taliban. The Taliban came into power saying they were going to be inclusive. And if you look at their, other than the fact that obviously there are no women at all in the government to speak of, if you look at the ethnic makeup of the Taliban government, they have like one Hazara member and one Tajik member and one Uzbek member. Everybody else is the Pashtun. So if that's really the case, it actually kind of makes sense that ISIS-K would be able to recruit people from other ethnic groups in Afghanistan, because if it's really positioning itself as an anti-Taliban sort of insurgency, like who would they recruit to do that? Tajiks and Uzbeks.
It doesn't seem like the Taliban is capable or interested, I'm not sure which one it is, in defeating ISIS-K.
Yeah, the UN report from 2023 says it has 4,000 to 6,000 members. Afghanistan is a pretty large country. It's a great place to mount an insurgency, be a guerrilla force, as the Taliban know themselves. So I'm sure the Taliban would like to get rid of ISIS-K if they could. But it's not that easy. The United States couldn't get rid of the Taliban.
That's right. The U.S. lost the war. You once...
Well, I would actually amend that. The U.S. withdrew from the war. It didn't really lose it. It just said we're just going to wash our hands of it.
Well, it could not defeat the Taliban, though.
Before President Biden announced withdrawal, the Taliban didn't control any one of the provincial cities, of which there are 34 in Afghanistan. The Taliban weren't able to take any major city for more than any city at all for more than a few days throughout the war.
That's true. Well, it's been said that guerrillas win by not losing.
That is true, but we simply just said we're just leaving, and we left. With 2,500 American troops on the ground, the Taliban were not able to take any provincial cities in the 34 Afghan provinces. So
the air support was key to help the Afghan army there.
It was.
You once interviewed Osama bin Laden. I take it you have not interviewed Sanullah Ghaffari, who is apparently the leader of ISIS-K. This group is still somewhat of a mystery, as we've been discussing.
Well, it is. And I went on the State Department website because, frankly, I'd never heard of this guy.
He's 29 years old.
The State Department website has $10 million reward for him. So the biggest reward was $20 million for bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. So he's obviously wanted ultimately for in particular the attack on Kabul airport that killed 13 American service members. But there's almost nothing on the State Department website about him and his biography.
Yeah, he's 29 years old. A Reuters report citing sources from the Taliban says he is an Afghan Tajik who served as a soldier in the Afghan army and then joined ISIS-K later, which, as we've been discussing, was formed late 2014. Bin Laden was so important to the leadership of al-Qaeda that when he was out of the picture, I don't think the organization has ever recovered. And obviously took a beating during the war on terrorism as well. How important are these charismatic, if you will, leaders to groups like ISIS-K and all these other groups that populate the region?
Well, I think in bin Laden's case, without bin Laden, there wouldn't have been 9/11. There could have been a leader of al-Qaeda that didn't carry out the 9/11 attacks and that focused on maybe attacks in the Arab world, and we wouldn't be having this discussion, I don't think, because I don't think it was only somebody with bin Laden's sort of charisma and ambition that you get 9/11. But let me go back to al-Qaeda in Iraq. So you remember Abu Musab al-Zakari was the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he was killed in a U.S. strike in 2006. It made no difference at all to what then went on. I mean, al-Qaeda in Iraq continued fomenting the Iraqi civil war in which hundreds of thousands of people died. It eventually took a beating, but then it reemerged as ISIS. There is a tendency to want to focus on the leaders and try and kill them or capture them. We mentioned Qasem Soleimani. He was a military leader of a state organization. That organization has continued. The military leadership of Hamas, the Israeli government is trying to kill Sinwar and Mohammed Deif. It might make some difference, but I don't think Hamas military leadership is going to fold up its tent because its two leaders are killed.
Yeah, I guess it depends on which group we're talking about then.
Yeah.
Maybe the most important point here in our conversation, Peter Bergen, is what all of this means. I mentioned Renaud Mansour. I talked to him in my most recent episode about groups in Iraq, armed groups that sided with the United States to fight ISIS several years ago. And now some of these groups are bombing U.S. bases in Iraq today. Not all of them. Some of them are more interested in just Iraqi state stability. But some of them are allied to Iran. Matter of fact, one of them was behind the attack in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. service members. And this is the problem in Iraq. You have these groups that are interconnected with the Iraqi state, politically, socially, economically. But on the other hand, you have groups like ISIS-K that don't seem really interested in having that kind of role within their state. They're jihadist groups that are bent on violence and war, at least for now. Al-Qaeda was this way as well. We've discussed Al-Qaeda ideas and, what did they have to offer? What is the actual legacy of bin Laden besides death and destruction? So I guess this is a very long way of trying to set up a response from you, Peter. It just makes analyzing the situation very difficult because if you just lump all these groups into one category, terrorism, well, then you kind of miss the detail of what each of them is trying to do.
Well, that's true. And I mean, in Iraq, these Iran-backed militias, which the United States was de facto allied with when they were fighting ISIS, some of those militias have just been absorbed into the Iraqi military. Some of them continue to exist as independent political forces. Some of them are attacking U.S. military bases. Since October 7th, there have been more than 170 attacks on U.S. military bases in Syria and Iraq by these Iranian-backed militias. You mentioned the 3 American service members who were killed in Jordan. After that, I think the Iranian government told the Iranian militias to let's dial back the pressure here because we don't want to get into a war with the United States. And I'm sure we've told the Iranians pretty clearly what our red lines are, which is definitely U.S. service members getting killed. Many of these groups are fighting each other.
And do you believe that a certain way of looking at the world, great power conflict, Russia, China, the alliance of autocracies, and the U.S. is leading a coalition of democracies, I think that's just inadequate. In this context, where these groups have transnational activity, if not transnational ambitions, borders don't really matter. And as I said, some of these groups are interconnected with their states and politics and the economy. You mentioned to me once how Hezbollah has seats in the Lebanese parliament. So Don't you think that way of looking at the world as a great power competition like it's the 19th century is just inadequate to the task of understanding the challenge that we're facing here security-wise?
Maybe. I mean, I certainly we, the United States, as we configured its defense policy into a great power competition with China and to some degree Russia, that doesn't mean that these non-state actors won't continue doing what they're doing. I mean, I thought it was interesting that in both the Iran case and in the case in Moscow, I mean, the United States warned the Iranian government of the potential terrorist attack in the lead up to the attack that killed 84 people at Qasem Soleimani's memorial. And they also warned very clearly the Russians, and apparently even about this specific concert hall, even though that we are in a lot of competition with Iran, and even though we're in quite a lot of competition with Russia, we still felt it was our duty to warn them that these attacks were brewing. And we did. Putin very stupidly ignored these warnings and said some nonsensical things about it was the United States trying to blackmail Russia. It shows some pretty good intelligence gathering by the United States.
Each time the U.S. believes it is solving one problem, it seems to give life to another one. Saddam Hussein, there was really no al-Qaeda presence in Iraq. Get rid of him, al-Qaeda's a problem in Iraq. Then, as you said, they morph into something else. And also, something you brought up with Christine Abizaid, we can end on this note, how the terror threat itself has morphed, how these groups have changed since al-Qaeda's heyday, if you will.
Yeah. Well, Christine Abizaid said, obviously, Hamas, the attack on Israel on October 7th has been tremendously energizing for these groups, and they all want to attach themselves to it, al-Qaeda and ISIS and others, even though really al-Qaeda and ISIS, I mean, the Palestinian issue it was a big issue for bin Laden, but it hasn't been a big issue for these groups in the past, except from a rhetorical point of view. So obviously political violence always keeps morphing in. And we've seen that in this country where the real threat is not from al-Qaeda or jihadists. It's from right-wing extremists right now.
We're dealing with weak and chaotic states. Militias can have this much power. It would be, we have militias in the U.S., but as long as they're not doing militia things, they're left alone. Private militias are illegal, but you can go have a barbecue with your militia buddies as long as you're not doing militia-type things. You know what I mean? It would be like a militia taking over, I don't know, Wyoming, and then the U.S. government not being able to crush it.
There's kind of a political law you can make, which is the weaker a Muslim majority state is, the more likely you'll see that these groups exist. Whether it's Syria or Afghanistan or parts of Pakistan and even parts of the Philippines and parts of Indonesia. I mean, the stronger a Muslim majority state is, the more likely they are able to kind of attack these groups. And Saudi Arabia had a huge problem in the 2004-2005 period from Al-Qaeda. They faced almost a domestic insurgency. They brutally wiped it out, and that's why Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula no longer exists in Saudi Arabia, but it does exist in Yemen, which is a very weak, chaotic state in the middle of a civil war. So I agree. I mean, this is really about the lack of state control to a large degree. These groups function in vacuums or quasi-vacuums.
Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory.
And more than 20 years later, still waiting for victory. Let's thank Peter Bergen for returning to the podcast. And again, his show is In the Room with Peter Bergen, a podcast produced by Audible. If you enjoy my show, you may also enjoy the topics he covers. We cover similar ground. On the next episode of History as It Happens, speaking of conflict and borders, we're going to focus on the crisis at the southern border between the United States and Mexico, and the origins of the waves of human migration, which can be traced to U.S. Cold War policy in Central America. Historian Julia Young will join us next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.